There's a claim that you've likely heard. It's a cornerstone of modern Christian apologetics. It's often delivered with an air of unshakable confidence and arrogance. It goes something like this. Without God, there can be no objective morality. Without a divine lawgiver, right and wrong are just matters of opinion, of personal feeling, of what society decides on a whim. Atheists, they say, have no solid ground to stand on. Their morality is subjective. Admittedly, it's a powerful argument because it taps into our innate sense that some things, like torturing children for fun, are wrong, not just because we feel that they are, but because they just are. The Christian apologist offers a solution, a divine, unchanging, perfect standard of morality, handed down by God himself, written in the pages of the Holy Bible, objective, absolute, clear. But what if this is the greatest illusion and, quite frankly, biggest stinking, steaming pile of dung in the entire theological playbook? What if, when you actually open the book and examine the foundation, you find that it's not solid rock, but shifting sand? What if this supposed bedrock of objective morality is, in fact, a masterclass in contradiction, ambiguity, and terrifying subjectivity? Today on Skepticus, we are going to dismantle this whole ridiculous claim of objective Christian morality. We're not going to talk about atheistic ethics. That's a topic that we definitely need to cover in another day. But we are going to focus exclusively on their book, their claims, and their God. And we're going to show you, using chapter and verse, how this supposedly objective system is, first, hopelessly contradictory, offering opposing commands on fundamental moral issues. Second, so vague and poorly defined that it invites an infinite spectrum of personal interpretation. Third, it's based on a practice of cherry picking, where even the explicit commands of Jesus Christ himself are casually ignored by the vast majority of his followers. Fourth, it's founded on a principle that is so morally bankrupt that goodness is simply whatever God says, that it endorses acts we would recognize as monstrous. And finally, and perhaps most dangerously, we'll show how this system creates a divine blank check, a loophole that allows any person to claim a command from God for any act, no matter how heinous, with no possible way to disprove them using the Bible itself. So stick with me. By the end of this, you'll see that the claim to objective morality is not Christianity's greatest strength, but instead its most profound and dangerous weakness. Let's start with a foundational principle of logic. An objective, coherent system of truth cannot contain direct, mutually exclusive contradictions. If a math textbook says in one chapter that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and in another chapter it says 2 plus 2 equals 5, or 2 plus 2 equals banana, you wouldn't call it an objective source for mathematics. You'd call it flawed and completely unreliable. The Bible, we're told, is the inerrant objective source of God's moral law. So let's see if it passes the contradiction test. Let's start with violence and retribution. In the Old Testament, the principle of justice is laid out very clearly. Exodus chapter 21, verse 24 gives us the famous dictum, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. This is the principle of lex talionis, or retributive justice. It is presented as a command from God. It's objective. If someone takes your eye, you are morally justified in taking theirs. But now let's fast forward to the New Testament, to the centerpiece of Christian ethics, the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus directly addresses this old law. Starting in verse 38, he says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." So to be clear, this is not a minor clarification. This is a complete moral reversal. One objective command says, take an eye for an eye. The other, from the mouth of God incarnate, says, do not resist an evil person and turn the other cheek. So, which is the objective moral truth? Is it retaliatory justice or radical pacifism? The Bible commands both. You cannot objectively follow both commands. They are opposites. The choice of which one to follow is, by definition, a completely subjective one. And before you give me this standard retort, which is that, well, Jesus overwrote the old law, or Jesus came to give us new laws, that's fine if you want to believe that. But the deeper point is this. You cannot tell me that the original law from God himself was an objective moral truth, and also tell me that Jesus's new law is objective moral truth. You can't have two objective moral truths that are in direct and opposite contradiction with each other. That doesn't work. Let's take another one. Peace versus the sword. In that same sermon in Matthew 5:9, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." This aligns with the pacifist reading. But just a few chapters later, in Mark chapter 10, verse 34, Jesus says something startlingly different. "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." So, is the objective moral path to be a peacemaker, or to embrace the sword of division that Christ brings? The Bible gives you justification for both positions. A Christian can subjectively choose the verse that best fits their pre-existing disposition, whether they are a Quaker or a Crusader. That is not objective truth or objective morality. That is the definition of subjectivity. How about judging others? This is a favorite. In Matthew 7, verse 1, we get the clear command, "Judge not, that you not be judged." This is often quoted to promote a message of non-judgmental acceptance. But is that the whole story? In 1 John 4, verse 1, the author commands believers, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." Testing spirits requires making a judgment. The Apostle Paul is even more explicit. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he chastises the church for not judging a member who is sleeping with his father's wife. In verse 12, he asks, "What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside?" So, are Christians commanded not to judge? Or are they commanded to judge those inside the church? The answer is yes. Again, the believer is left to subjectively pick which command to emphasize, and they will usually pick whichever command best suits their rhetorical needs at the current time. One last example. Wealth. Is it a sign of God's blessing or a spiritual poison? The Old Testament, particularly in books like Deuteronomy, is filled with promises that obedience to God will result in material prosperity. Deuteronomy 28, verses 11 through 12, promise that the Lord will grant you abundant prosperity, and open the heavens, to bless all the work of your hands. This is the foundation of the modern prosperity gospel. But then we get to Jesus, who seems to have a radically different view. In Mark chapter 10, verse 25, he says, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven." He tells the rich young ruler to sell everything that he has and give it to the poor. That's from Mark 10, verse 21. He tells his followers they cannot serve both God and money. That's from Matthew 6, verse 24. So which is the objective truth again? Is wealth a sign of God's favor to be celebrated, or a dangerous obstacle to salvation to be discarded? The Bible provides strong support for both views. A book filled with such fundamental moral contradictions cannot be the basis for any type of so-called objective morality. It is, by its very nature, a menu from which to make subjective choices. But the problem goes deeper than just direct contradiction. What about the parts that aren't contradictory, just hopelessly unclear? For a moral command to supposedly be objective, it must be clear. If a law is so vague that nobody can agree on what it means, it ceases to be any type of objective standard, and it becomes a screen onto which we project our own subjective ideas. The Bible is filled with these kinds of morally vague statements. The most famous example is what Jesus calls the second greatest commandment, found in Leviticus 19, verse 18, and repeated in Matthew 22, verse 39. Love your neighbor as yourself. This sounds beautiful. It sounds simple. But what does it actually mean to love your neighbor in a practical, moral sense? Ask a progressive Christian, and they might say love means radical acceptance, affirming people as they are, supporting their choices, and fighting for social justice on their behalf. Ask a conservative Christian, and they might say love means caring for your neighbor's eternal soul, which means telling them the hard truth about their sin, confronting their lifestyle, and calling them to repentance, even if it hurts their feelings. As they often say, love warns. Both groups are using the exact same objective command. Both sincerely believe that they're fulfilling it, yet their actions are polar opposites. The command is so broad, so lacking in specific, actionable definition that it becomes a justification for whatever moral framework the believer already holds. It's a moral Rorschach test. You see in it what you want to see. Let's take another one from the Ten Commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12 says, honor your father and your mother. Again, sounds great, doesn't it? But what does honor entail? Does it mean absolute, unquestioning obedience for your entire life? Does it mean that you must adopt their religion and their politics? Does it mean you have to financially support them in their old age, no matter the cost to your own family? What if your father is abusive? Does honoring him mean quietly enduring the abuse? What if your parents command you to do something that you believe is immoral? An objective moral code would provide a clear rubric to navigate these complex situations. The Bible absolutely does not. It just gives the vague command, honor, leaving billions of people to subjectively interpret its meaning and application in their unique circumstances. The vagueness is especially problematic when it comes to issues of power and submission. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, the text says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. And a few verses later, in chapter 6, verse 5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. For centuries, these verses were used to justify the absolute authority of husbands and the brutal institution of chattel slavery. Today, more progressive interpreters perform stunning theological gymnastics to reframe these verses. They'll say that submit doesn't mean what it sounds like, or that it must be read in the context of mutual submission, or that the slavery verse was a product of its time and culture. The point is that the objective text is so ambiguous that it can be, and has been, used to support both complementarian patriarchy and egalitarian partnership, both slavery and abolition. The interpretation is driven not by the text itself, but by the evolving moral landscape of the society reading it. That is the very definition of subjective relative morality. Anytime you have a massive societal issue like slavery that has been credibly backed up by the Bible and credibly attacked by people using that same Bible, that tells you that by definition, the Bible's morality on this issue is incredibly subjective and absolutely not objective. The result of all this contradiction and vagueness is the world that we see today. Over 1,000 different Christian denominations, all reading from the same book, and all coming to wildly different conclusions about what God wants, what is moral, and how to live. If the Bible were a source of objective morality, this would be impossible. So we have a book that contradicts itself and is too vague to be a reliable guide. But what happens when the Bible is crystal clear? What happens when God, or Jesus himself, gives a direct, unambiguous command? Surely then, Christians follow it, right? Well, that leads us to the most staggering act of collective subjectivity in all of Christianity. If there is one thing an objective moral law cannot tolerate, it's being optional. An unchanging law from an unchanging God should apply to all people at all times. Jesus Christ himself seemed to make this exact point in the clearest, most explicit language imaginable. Again, let's go to the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 17. Jesus is addressing the Mosaic law, the 613 commands of the Old Testament, and he says this: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." I want you to pause and think about how stunningly clear that is. He says that he did not come to abolish the law. He says not a single jot, an iota, or a tittle, a tiny pen stroke of the law will disappear until heaven and earth pass away. And he finishes by saying that anyone who sets aside even the least of these commands and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom. This is a direct, objective command from the central figure of Christianity to continue observing the entirety of the Old Testament law. That includes the dietary laws, the purity codes, the laws about clothing, and the punishments for breaking them. So, do Christians obey this clear, objective command from their Savior? Almost none of them do. Why do Christians eat bacon and shellfish when Leviticus chapter 11 explicitly forbids it? Why do they wear clothes made of mixed fabrics like cotton polyester blends when Leviticus 19:19 forbids it? Why aren't they stoning disobedient children as commanded in Deuteronomy 21? They'll tell you that these laws no longer apply. They will say we are under a new covenant. They will cite the Apostle Paul, who argued extensively in his letters to the Galatians and Romans that believers are not under the law, but under grace. That's from Romans 6:14. They will point to Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10, where God presents him with a sheet of unclean animals and tells him to kill and eat. But in doing so, they are making a subjective choice to elevate the writings of Paul and the visions of Peter above the explicit, direct, unambiguous words of Jesus Christ himself. They are, by Jesus' own definition in Matthew 5, setting aside the commands and teaching others to do the same. This is the ultimate cherry picking. They have taken the foundational legal code of their religion, affirmed in the strongest possible terms by their God, and declared huge swaths of it null and void because it is inconvenient and, quite frankly, bizarre. There's no objective principle at work here. It is a subjective, post hoc process of deciding which parts of God's objective law they feel like following. And if they can do that with a command as clear as Matthew 5:17-19, then they can do it with anything. So we have contradictions, vagueness, and rampant cherry picking. But now we must turn to the darkest corner of this issue. What happens when God's objective commands are not just inconvenient, but are actively, monstrously evil? We now arrive at the philosophical heart of the matter. The Christian claim to objective morality rests on a foundation known as divine command theory. In its simplest form, it states that what is morally good is good simply because God commands it. Goodness is defined not as an independent standard that God adheres to. Goodness is defined as whatever God wills. This sounds neat and tidy, but it has a horrifying implication. It means that if God were to command something like genocide or slavery or the murder of children, those actions would become, by definition, objectively good. The Christian apologist will typically respond, but God would never command such things. He is perfectly good. The problem with that defense is that, according to the Bible, he already has. The objective moral commands in the Bible are not limited to love your neighbor. They also include some of the most barbaric and evil instructions ever put to paper. Let's talk about genocide. In the book of Deuteronomy, as the Israelites are preparing to enter the promised land, God gives them these explicit instructions regarding the inhabitants. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1-2. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. Destroy them totally. Show them no mercy. In case that wasn't clear enough, it's repeated in chapter 20, verses 16-17. However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them as the Lord your God has commanded you. This is not a regrettable side effect of ancient warfare. This is a direct divine command for ethnic cleansing. This is God, the supposed source of objective good, commanding genocide. Let's talk about slavery. The Bible does not condemn slavery. It regulates it. Exodus chapter 21 provides a set of rules for owning human beings. And in verses 20 through 21, we find this chilling passage. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Let that sink in. The objective moral law of God states that if you beat your slave so severely that they die, you are not to be punished as long as they cling to life for a day or two. The reason given? Because the human being you just beat to death is your property. This is a divine endorsement of chattel slavery and brutal violence. How about infanticide? In Exodus 12, God's final plague on Egypt is to go through the land and kill the firstborn son of every Egyptian household. This is divine mass child killing. In Psalm 137, verse 9, after a lament about the Babylonians, the psalmist concludes with this blessing. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. And in Hosea 13, verse 16, God pronounces judgment on Samaria, saying, they will fall by the sword. Their little ones will be dashed to the ground. Their pregnant women ripped open. So when an apologist says God is the foundation of objective good, what they are really saying is that the foundation of objective good includes genocide, slavery, and infanticide. This is the ultimate bankruptcy of divine command theory. It doesn't provide an objective principle for morality that we can use to reason about new situations. It just provides a list of decrees. We cannot derive a general moral principle from genocide is good sometimes, or slavery is acceptable if they are your property. All it tells us is that good is whatever the most powerful being says that it is. That is not morality. It's a cosmic protection racket. This reveals that the Christian isn't actually getting their morality from the Bible. They are doing what all humans do, using their own innate, evolved sense of empathy and reason to decide that genocide and slavery are wrong. And because those things are commanded in their holy book, they must then invent elaborate excuses like, oh, it was a different time, or oh, it was metaphorical, to explain them away. They are subjectively judging God's objective commands and finding them to be wanting. But this leads us to the final and most terrifying problem. The system's ultimate flaw, which turns it from a mere philosophical mess into a genuinely dangerous ideology. We've seen that the Bible's moral system is contradictory, vague, subject to cherry picking, and founded on commands that are morally repugnant. But the final nail in the coffin of so-called objective morality is this. The system provides a perfect, unforgeable permission slip for literally any act imaginable. Think about the character of God as he is portrayed in the Bible. He is a being who has commanded his followers to kill every man, woman, and child in a city. He has laid out rules for beating slaves. He has commanded a father Abraham to take his own son up on a mountain and ritually sacrifice him. Because this is the established character of God, a believer can never say with certainty that God would never command me to do X if X is a violent or horrifying act. Why not? He already has on multiple occasions in their own holy book. Now let's bring this into the modern world. What happens when a pastor gets on stage and says, God has spoken to me and he has commanded our church to shun all homosexuals and their children? What happens when a politician claims that God has told me that our nation must go to war, for he is on our side? What happens when your neighbor tells you with tears in their eyes that God has commanded them to do something unspeakable because it is a test of their faith, just like Abraham? How can another Christian using only the Bible prove that this command is not from God? The simple answer is that they can't. It's impossible. They can say, well, that doesn't sound like the God of love that I know. But the person claiming the revelation can point to Deuteronomy 7, to Exodus 21, to Genesis 22, and say, are you saying the God of the Bible is not a God of love? He has commanded these things before. He is commanding me now. They can say, we need to test the spirits. But how? What is the test? In a world where God is steadfastly hidden, where he performs no public miracles, writes no messages in the sky, and offers no independent confirmation of anything, what objective test could possibly be run? There is none. The entire system collapses into the most extreme and dangerous form of subjectivity imaginable. The unverified, unfalsifiable private claim of a single human being. The apologist's claim to have objective morality is just a shield. But behind that shield, there is not a clear, consistent code. It's a moral abyss. It's a system where the so-called objective truth is whatever a person can convince themselves or others that God whispered into their ear. This is not a foundation for morality. It's a recipe for moral anarchy, justified by divine sanction. It has been used to justify crusades, inquisitions, slavery, apartheid, and countless acts of abuse and bigotry. And it can all be traced back to the fundamental flaws in the source code itself. So let's review. The Christian claim to a unique, objective morality is an illusion. In fact, it's complete and utter bullshit. It's a lie. We've seen that its foundational text, the Bible, is filled with direct moral contradictions, forcing a subjective choice between opposing commands. We've seen that its key principles are often so vague that they become a Rorschach test for our own pre-existing biases, leading to thousands of denominations with competing moral views. We've seen that its followers engage in mass cherry-picking, flagrantly ignoring the crystal clear commands of Jesus Christ himself when they become inconvenient to them. We've seen that its very foundation, divine command theory, is built on a quicksand of morally repugnant acts, endorsing genocide and slavery, offering no usable principles, only a worship of raw power. And finally, we've seen how this entire broken system creates a divine blank check, where any personal claim to a divine command, no matter how evil, cannot be biblically or empirically disproven, making it the most radically subjective and dangerous moral system that one could possibly devise. The truth is, Christians do not get their morality from the Bible. They get it from the same place every other human does, from our evolved capacity for empathy, our powers of reason, our cultural inheritance, and our ongoing conversation about how to live together and flourish. They then project that morality back onto their holy book, highlighting the parts that they like love your neighbor, and desperately explaining away the parts that they don't, like dash their infants against the rocks. This pretense of objective morality is just that. It's a complete smokescreen. A comforting story they tell themselves to feel that their moral intuitions have cosmic significance. But the moment that you look behind the curtain, the entire edifice collapses. A truly objective morality must be based on observable realities, like well-being and the reduction of harm, accessible to all people through reason and evidence, not on the capricious, contradictory, and often monstrous whims of a hidden God. What do you think? Did I miss a key verse or a philosophical argument that resolves these issues? Let me know in the comments below. I'm always open to the discussion. If you appreciate this kind of in-depth, evidence-based skepticism, please like this video and subscribe to Skepticus. I hope to see you again soon. If I have said anything that has in any way offended Yahweh or Jebus or the Holy Spirit, they are free at any time to chime in and correct me on anything that I've said. Guys, it's your moment. Yeah, I didn't think so. I hope to see you on future videos. Until I do, I will leave you with this. Lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.